Well, good morning. It's Wednesday, and this is our Genesis midweek sermon as part of our sermon series through the book of Genesis. Today, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 21. So if you want to take a moment, you can even pause this video right now and read through Genesis chapter 21. Our time here will be quite brief as we explore this part of the book, this part of the narrative. There are a couple things that we do want to pick up on. But again, if you have a Bible, open it up, turn it on, keep your finger there as we explore Genesis chapter 21. So here it is now, 25 years later. 25 years later, God's promise to Abraham and to Sarah is now coming to fruition. We're told here in this moment that Abraham and Sarah, they have their son and they name him Isaac. And so God, now has fulfilled this major promise to Abraham and Isaac and to Sarah. A 100-year-old man and his 90-year-old wife finally give birth to the promise that God was going to bless them with. And so Sarah became pregnant. She bore Abraham a son in his old age at the very time God had promised. So back in Genesis 18, God had promised at this point next year, you're going to have a son. Now, again, I just want to pick up on a few things that we were talking about previously. Back a few chapters before that, God is promising that, yes, Abraham, you will have a son. And Abraham laughs. He laughs. And it's actually considered a laughter of joy and excitement. God, you're actually going to do this. You're actually going to fulfill this. I'm so excited to see what you will do. In Genesis 18, we have that God is saying, at this time next year, you're going to have a child. And Sarah laughs, but her laugh is actually a cynical laugh. One, I'm almost 90. I'm well past the years of having children. How is it that you're going to do this, God? And actually, the angel and God rebuke Sarah for her laughter in that moment. And so now we just see that all of this comes to fulfillment. Even in the midst of some cynicism, skepticism, even in the midst of excitement, it finally comes to fruition. Can you imagine all the emotions going through this couple as they find out they're pregnant, as they find out that they're going to have this child, that God's faithful promise, even though it's taken so long, 25 years, it's taken such a long time, it's coming to fruition. I don't know about you, but sometimes when God's promises, again, they're not necessarily just these security promises that we hope they are, but they're bigger than that, they're deeper than that, and they're soul nourishing. Sometimes for us to really grasp them or to experience them, it can take a while, partly because of our own ignorance and our own way of thinking or our own misunderstandings of God's promises. But here's the amazing thing is that, again, God shows himself always to be someone who fulfills the promises he makes. I liken it to the very fact that you have the check in hand and it's paid for, it's there, it's secure, that all you need to do is just simply deposit. All you simply need to do is bank on it. And so don't forget, sometimes delays in God's fulfilled promises, they're not denials. Delays are not denials. They're not the same thing. Sometimes when we ask of God, God says yes, God says no, and God says wait even. And sometimes it's in the waiting that we're hard-pressed to give up. We're hard-pressed to not believe, or we're hard-pressed to believe that somehow God is saying no. Sometimes it really is a delay. And so here's 25 years for this couple to experience the fulfillment of God's promise. So we're told in verses 3 to 7, they name Isaac. They name their son Isaac. His name means to laugh. Again, because Abraham laughed with joy, Sarah laughed with cynicism. Another key thing is that we're told that on the 8th day, Isaac is circumcised. And so what that means, again, is God made a covenant with Abraham, and that covenant was that the males of his household would be circumcised, and especially any newborn males, they would be circumcised on the 8th day. And so what that is a simple reminder. God's fulfilling his promise. Abraham is learning now in faith to fulfill his promise. So he does what he's supposed to do. He circumcises Isaac on the 8th day as per the covenant, as per the agreement that they had. And so this is an example, again, of Abraham's growing faith. Now you had this great moment where the promise has been fulfilled. The promise has been fulfilled, and I follow through with my part in the promise, which was to circumcise him. And we're told at that point Abraham is also 100 years old. 100 years old. Sarah is about 90 at this point. And then we have the conflict. Here's the conflict that arises. At about verse 8, we find that Isaac is weaned, which puts him in the age of around 2 to 3 years old. He's no longer dependent on mommy for milk, and he's potty trained and sleep trained, whatever you want to think of and imagine there. And they have this feast and the celebration, which is a cultural norm. And then the tension arises because in that moment, Abraham's other son, his illegitimate son, his surrogate son, he laughs. He laughs at Isaac in that moment. And again, that laughter in that moment, it's not one of joy, it's not one of cynicism, it's one of scoffing and making fun of and belittling. And so Ishmael at this point is about 17 years old compared to Isaac's 3-year-old. It's just like the idea of a big, big bully. And at this point now, this is the consequence of Abraham and Sarah when they had taken God's plan and they had taken it into their own hands and tried to do something with it, and they made a mess of it. It's now coming to roost. I think just a simple tidbit theologically for us to think about when we talk about this. The consequences of our sin, the consequences of our actions are not always immediate. The consequences of our sin and our sin actions are not always immediate. And that's one of the scary things. Is sometimes when we sin, we think and we're looking for an immediate response or immediate reaction to that sin. And sometimes when we don't have it, when there's no immediate punishment or there's no immediate discipline, when we don't have it, we think we've gotten away with it, or we think that it's okay what we have done. Sometimes those consequences, they show up much later. And here's an example of the consequence of Abraham and Sarah's sins showing up so much later, to the point that it even threatens God's promise to a degree. And so Sarah is upset with Ishmael and how he's treating Isaac. She's upset with Hagar for the very fact that she had Ishmael with Abraham. And so she wants them sent on their way. And so Abraham is now, he's in a bind. He's a little bit disturbed as to what to do. And so it says in verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. And so Abraham is torn. He does have a relationship with Ishmael. He is concerned about that. And God reassures him, no, I will take care of them. I will take care of them. Verse 14 gives us this one little phrase, and I just want to highlight it. It says, early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. I just want to point that out. Early the next morning. That becomes this euphemism for a lot of Abraham's journey, is that he's learning to trust God. He's learning to bank on the promises of God. He's growing in his faith with God. And one of the ways that you can tell that Abraham is growing is that this phrase, early the next morning, is going to keep appearing. When Abraham is growing in his faith and learning, whenever God instructs him something, it says early the next morning. That means as soon as possible, the next moment available, he does what God asks him to do. He does what God asks him to do. Can you just imagine that and learn that for ourselves? That when God invites us to participate in what he's doing, when God invites us to be part of his plan, when God makes a promise to us that he's going to fulfill, and when he asks us to do something, that we don't hesitate. Early the next morning, the next possible moment, we take action. We take action at the next possible moment. That's something that I think if you could highlight every time Abraham's life, as he progresses in his faith, as he grows in his faith, he learns that at the next moment possible, I'm going to follow through in active obedience to what God is asking me to do. And I think that's a life lesson for us as we also journey in this thing called faith. And so this idea of early the next morning implies this quick and fast obedience to what God is asking him to do. And so he sends Hagar and Ishmael away. Now I do have an issue with kind of what Abraham does here, and I'm not sure what I want to do with that still. He sends them away with a little bit of food and a little bit of water, and that's it. Abraham is actually a wealthy man at this point. He's a wealthy man. He has enough resources. He just sends them on their way. He doesn't give them a caravan. He doesn't give them any other protection like a soldier or a militia member. He doesn't even give them a lot of stuff to take. He just gives them the bare minimum and he sends them on his way. Now, what do we do with that? I think there's two things maybe that we can see. Either Abraham is just following a custom of that time of how they would release slaves. There's maybe a cultural piece to that, and that's quite possible. But perhaps the other one is the very fact that Abraham is growing in his faith and that God said, I will take care of them. And so Abraham says, okay. And so I'm just going to give them the bare minimum, and God, you will take care of them. Is this an example of Abraham's faith and trust growing? And I think we can see a bit of that he's trusting in God, that God would take care of them, because God said he was the one who was going to take care of them, and he would actually make Ishmael into a great nation as well. So God, if you make that promise, I'm learning now to trust your promises, and I'm not going to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to trust. You said he's going to be a great nation. That means whatever happens, they're going to survive, they're going to do well, and they're going to be taken care of. And so I think this is an example of Abraham growing, and again, still learning and just growing in his faith and his trust in God. But then here's the heartbreaking part of the story, is that Hagar and Ishmael, as they're sent on their way, they burn through all the food, they burn through all the drink, and now they're fighting to stay alive. They're fighting to stay alive. And Hagar, this single mom with a teenage son, she doesn't know what to do. And at this point, the scripture gives us this indication is that they're even near death at this point. So in verse 15, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. And then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And she sat there and she began to sob. And so, it's heartbreaking at this point. But here is how God again shows up. It says in verse 17, God heard the boy crying, and the angel Lord called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. Again, that most important, most repeated commandment, do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Verse 19, then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. I want to pause here and just pick up on this narrative here. They're near death, and God intervenes, and God shows up, and God responds to Hagar. God is responding to Hagar in a very similar way to the first encounter Hagar had. Hagar was despised by Sarah for the very fact that she got pregnant with Abraham. Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham. They wanted to take matters into their own hands. She conceives, and she has Ishmael. And before she has the baby, she runs off, and God shows up. And God is very interesting when he talks to her. There's two words that I want you to take. He sees her, he hears her, and he sees her. Those are the two very important things. And this is the way God treats Hagar. He says, I hear Ishmael, I heard their cries, and I see you. And then I open your eyes to see. And I just want to take that as a very illustrative thing for our own faith journey, is that God is a God who sees and hears. And this is a culture and a world where there were gods everywhere. Anything could be a god, a rock, a tree, non-living things. And one of the indicators of these gods was that they were never able to see. They were deaf, blind, and dumb, is what they would say. They could not speak, they could not hear, and they could not see. And this living God, this one true God, acknowledges that I can see you and I can hear you. And I think also as a human person, that is a very important aspect of who we are. To be seen and to be heard is a very important piece of who we are. Think of all the times in our lives when we weren't heard, when nobody heard us, and how that makes us feel. When nobody sees us, how that makes us feel. And when it comes to children, when it comes to our teenage years, and when it comes even to our adult life, how do we feel honored, cared for, respected, loved? It's because we've been seen and we've been heard. And I think that's an illustrative thing for us to always grasp. How can we ensure that we're doing that to others? God does that for us. God does that to Hagar. He does that for us. He says, I see you and I hear you. And the invitation then is, how do we see and hear others? So from the homeless man on the street who gets passed by every day with people walking who don't see him, who don't hear his call for help to ask for change, how do we, as God's people, as Jesus people, respond to the idea of seeing and hearing? When we're at the playground with your kids, and your kids are saying, look, mommy, look what I can do. How many times I've seen parents who just don't see or hear their kids because of the dumb smartphone that they have in their hand. They're obsessed with whatever it is they're doing on their phones, that kids are just longing for their attention, to be seen and to be heard. You and I are constantly longing for others to see and hear us, and there are many who are neglected in our world who are no longer seen and heard. And I think it's the invitation of God to remind us that as Jesus people, that we are involved in his great plan of seeing people and hearing them. This is part of the value and dignity and worth that God gave us, as we talk about the beginning of Genesis, that we're created in the image of God to be seen and to be heard. And that's something that I think we can take away from this part of Hagar and Ishmael's story. And so God says, I see you and I hear you, and he provides for them and he saves them and he rescues them. And we will be told later on, we will see how Ishmael does become this great nation. So with that, this closing part of Hagar's life is that Hagar found an Egyptian wife for Ishmael. And again, Hagar is from Egypt. She goes back to her homeland, to the people that she knows. She finds an Egyptian woman from her heritage to marry her son. And Ishmael survives, and he becomes a hunter, and eventually becomes a great nation. And so we're told in Genesis 25 about the 12 sons of Ishmael later on. So you can always go ahead and pick that up there. Today, how we see this as well is that in our modern day, we see this how in the Middle East and with Muslims and the Arab world, how Ishmael's narrative actually comes into play. So Abraham's story here with Ishmael, they do become a great nation. Isaac becomes the father of the nation of Israel. Ishmael becomes part and parcel of this Arab Muslim lineage, and there are some genealogies that you can trace back to that as well. And so that part of Hagar and Ishmael's story now comes to a conclusion, and there's a thread that gets picked up later in Genesis 25. But after all that, we get into verse 22, and we pick up again the story of Abraham's interaction with Abimelech. This past Sunday, we looked at, again, Abraham's failure with Abimelech, is that he allowed Abimelech to take his wife, Sarah. He said, that's my sister, go ahead and have her, and it put God's plan in jeopardy. God shows up and he rebukes Abimelech, and Abimelech then rebukes Abraham. And again, on Sunday, we were talking about how sometimes the way we fail can compromise our witness for God. And here's the story then of Abimelech and Abraham. They're interacting again. So in verse 22 to 34. In terms of this narrative, it just picks up the very fact that there's a conflict of just space and being respectful of one another. And this whole time, Abimelech is still observing Abraham. This whole time, Abimelech, it says he's watching, he's seeing, he's looking at Abraham's life. And so I just want to maybe pull that back and just apply that to us again. I share with you the story of how I've messed up, and we've messed up our witness many times. Sometimes we are the worst, sometimes when we become hypocrites in our own faith. But that's never enough to stop us in our faith journey. It's not to stop us from progressing in our faith journey. We need to learn from those mistakes and try our best to continue to represent God as his people today. But Abimelech is still watching, and I think that may be something for us to consider. There are people still watching your faith journey. It could be a neighbor, it could be a family member, it could be someone in your workplace or someone in your school. They're still watching your faith journey. They want to see how it plays out. And so again, God, he allows Abimelech to see Abraham. And in verse 22, he says it this way. He says, at that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. God is with you in everything you do. I see God doing things in you. And I hope that that's something we take to heart, that as we live our life as Jesus people could see God working in our lives. And I think the greatest compliment you can be paid as a Christian is that when someone who doesn't know God sits there and says, I see something different, but I see God in you. I see God working in your life. And so here's, Abraham, he's got so much going for him now that even his past mistake caught up with him with Hagar. His other past mistake with Abimelech is now redirected and used by God, in which Abimelech now sees God working in Abraham. And in fact, he then makes an alliance with Abraham. They create a covenant together, and they journey together in life. And I just want to invite us to think about that maybe God is working right now in the circumstances of your life. That people are seeing you, they don't know God, and they're joining in your life journey, that you would point them and direct them to see God. So let our actions and our speech, let the things that we do, how our work ethic is, how we treat others, how we use our resources of our house and food and money. My hope is that we would also recognize that people are watching us. Those who don't know God are watching us, and they want to see God in you. You claim that this God is amazing. Let's see. Show me the proof. Show me the proof. And that, yes, even though we failed before, and we may fail again, it's never enough to stop us on this faith journey of showing people Jesus. And I hope that that's something we take to heart in this passage here, that as the story of God's promise comes to fulfillment, as Abraham's past catches up with him in his sin, that God still fulfills and cares and he intervenes. And even his other past failure of misrepresenting God, it now gets redeemed, and that God can still use him. And I hope that's an encouragement for us, that no matter what it is that's gone on in our past, no matter what it is, it may catch up to us, but God is still working in that. And in our failures of representing God, God is still working in that and allowing people to see him working through us. The greatest compliment I think you can get, again, is when a non-believer says to you, I can see God in you. So my hope is that you would live your life in a way that people can see Jesus in us always. And so I hope that's an encouragement for you today, and a challenge for you in how we live our life. We'll see you this Sunday as we continue on in our Genesis series. God bless.